There we go. And now let's get started with the first session, which is called Oppression and Destructuring Boundaries. I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Van Armenian from the University of Ottawa. Van Armenian is a doctoral student at the University of Ottawa School of Music. His research is guided by extensive experience as a professional musician and a deep interest in how music can be a positive force for healing and societal consolidation. His thesis work focuses on the mechanisms that value the learning of Indigenous music as a tool for the development of a unifying and ethical Canadian identity, and which would contribute to making visible the experiential richness of Indigenous worldviews. He lives in Montreal with his wife, who is a school teacher, and his 2 teenage daughters. Van's paper is titled Degenociding Canada, Identity Reboot Through Indigenous Soundscapes. Please join me in welcoming Van.
Thank you very much, Emily and Carleton University for hosting this symposium. For thousands of years, long before the first Europeans arrived in what is now called Canada, Indigenous nations each formed a deep bond with their land, voicing this relationship through stories, sounds, and song. Through a toxic blend of settlers' racism, the complicity of science, and the aptly called papal bulls, these Indigenous identity constructions collapsed, and the relentless algorithm of colonialism that presupposes the dominant versus dominated dyad survived. Indeed, Indigenous voices continue to be invisibilized in Canada's soundscape. We ask then for reconciliation to work. What is Canada's identity today? What should it be, really? Are we ready to decolonize the reception of home and native land to make way for resurgent identities? This presentation will reflect on these questions and present options for rebooting Canadian identity with new hardware provided by Indigenous soundscapes. Updating this worldview would in fact not only uphold several international human rights conventions stipulating the child's right to dignified and quality education about the land he lives on, but it also does away with what Dylan Robinson describes as colonial listening's tin ears, that mute Indigenous aesthetics of the more than song. To achieve clarity and honesty in Canadian identity, I highlight a few startup education projects that show promising initial results, giving normative grounding to Canadian K-12 students. A resurgent listening of the beautiful kaleidoscope of timeless Indigenous soundscapes will, I suggest, help reconcile and redefine what Canadian identity can be and move us towards the necessary, what I call, degenociding of these lands. Perhaps it is not a coincidence that Saint Ambrose, the 4th century bishop of Milan, who coined the phrase, "when in Rome, do as the Romans do," was also credited with promoting antiphonal chant in an exchange of chants between 2 separate choirs during services. In fact, St. Ambrose saw value in music as a tool for community building. Williams writes, Ambrose's hymns demonstrated and articulated the unity of a diverse population by allowing the constituents to express themselves in a single voice. Ambrose was able to exploit the unity and harmony of his congregation in support of his own political and religious aims. When Western Europe's self-created image of modernity, developed in the Renaissance and Enlightenment eras, met with colonialism in the mid-15th century, a power relationship was woven into the fabric of interactions with Indigenous peoples on the newly discovered continents. This relationship, coined Coloniality Modernity by Mignolo, is based on racism and patriarchy, on demeaning indigenous knowledge and spirituality, and in imposing imperialistic viewpoints through the word of God, the word of reason and truth, and continues to have devastating repercussions to this day. Mississauga Anishinaabeg writer, musician, and scholar Leanne Simpson writes about reclaiming the, quote, worlds that have already been lost, end of quote. Indeed, worlds that were vibrant with life and lives that vibrated with the world. This almost faded way of being that the Anishinaabe call Kobade connects one like a chain to a distant ancestral past, but also a distant future generation, creating a continuum of life with responsibilities both to the past and to the future is the goal of this type of self-actualization. We must, in the end, Simpson says, give more than we take. Indigenous worldviews, languages, and philosophies, these are the types of homegrown and intrinsically land-based knowledge this land has inspired for millennia. This heritage is also what colonizing has sought to destroy when it decided it would not do as the Romans do. This profound heritage is what is being dehumanized, museumized, invisibilized to Canadian children. The colonial dream continues with not only the imposition of European sovereignty on these lands, but also the imposition of Eurocentric sovereignty on knowledge itself. Yet who says then that we cannot rewind the colonial tape and press a new play button that will allow our children to experience a more dignified and just education on these lands by hearing and learning from Indigenous voices and soundscapes, by becoming, at last, good guests on these lands. Perhaps we can do as St. Ambrose, use music. Since the dawn of time, music has not only nurtured the human spirit, but has been used to heal. The proto-human used vocalization and rhythm to improve their chances of finding a companion, to procreate better, to calm the newborn, and to improve clan unity. Furthermore, as we know, music has long been used to develop resilience and enable healing. Research has also confirmed that music education is a powerful agent of not only empowering underprivileged segments of society, an effective tool for social justice goals when administered with post-colonial methodologies, but can certainly, I believe, be considered as an effective tool for Canada's reconciliation goals, and indeed a reboot of Canadian identity itself. Europeans did not understand the First Peoples' music and its important link to the environment. Many, especially from the church, even considered it demoniacal. Canadian settler scholar Beverly Diamond describes Indigenous music as a holistic soundscape that evokes ways of being, connecting to the land and the past and a future generational continuum, very much like the Anishinaabe concept of Kobade described earlier. The settler presents indigeneity in a flat worldview, a space that eradicates the multiculturalism of Indigenous peoples and keeps them in the frame of, as Turner and Simpson describe, quote, modernity's antithesis. Métis scholar Brenda McDougall argues that this systematic devaluing of Indigenous culture and the fact that it is largely absent in the history of Canada is, quote, the root of the conflicted relationship between Aboriginal people and Canada. McDougall argues that true reconciliation can only come once Indigenous stories are told, quote, from their perspective, end of quote. That people's relationship to land can only come through the, quote, historical understanding of space and place, end of quote. Encompassing that space and place is its soundscape, the music, inspired by and created for the land. For Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard, This place-based decolonizing mechanism will be achieved through the practice of grounded normativity, defined as, quote, the modalities of indigenous land-connected practices and long-standing experiential knowledge that inform and structure our ethical engagements with the world and our relationships with human and non-human others over time. End of quote. Coulthard argues that the Canadian government's discourse around recognition, reconciliation, and accommodation is nothing but a continuation of the, quote, genocidal exclusion assimilation double. Like grounded normativity, music grounds us. Music has an innate power to induce kinesthetic sensations and memories embedded in the produced sound for both performer and listener. Carleton University's own Elaine Kyler describes music as a soundscape informed by, quote, cultural conditioning, including the geographical spaces in which the earlier feelings were formed. We constantly take in information from the geographical space. Kyler continues to explain that music expression for Indigenous peoples was rich and diverse and, quote, closely tied to climatic and geographical characteristics of the area. Each song from each region is coded with origin stories, values, morals, history, and traditions of the land. Music is, in a sense, part of the geography. It is, Kyler continues, right from the land. It is people, the trees, water, life, end of quote. Katrina Ann Oliveira maintains that it is in the land that we find memories and the material from which culture emanates and is defined. Oliveira, a Hawaiian scholar, asserts that to truly know a place is to be able to recite its stories. And to know a place is also to be able to chant the landscape through poetry. Considering that music is so geographically informed, it becomes clear that any transformative education framework would have to embrace the distinctiveness of at least 6 geographical regions in what is known as Canada today. We can therefore safely consider that music is normatively grounded in its geographical provenance. It is for this reason I believe music can be an important key to redefining Canadian identity in the spirit of reconciliation and reparation. Slow progress is being made nevertheless. Today, in response, certain government bodies are taking steps to decolonize education in Canada. The Ontario Ministry of Education is committed to, quote, support identity building for Indigenous students and to ensure all students in Ontario know and appreciate contemporary and traditional Indigenous cultures. In Emily Miles' 2017 study, we read the accounts by Indigenous and non-Indigenous educators and parents. Integrating Indigenous worldviews in schooling proved to be a very positive experience for all. Parents and teachers noticed character trait improvements such as heightened understanding, awareness, empathy, tolerance, and respect in the participating K-12 students. Furthermore, the same students were transforming in a good way their parents' and community perceptions of Indigenous history and culture, and therefore contributing to fighting racism and prejudice. The study also found that there was a reluctance to teach Indigenous worldviews in non-Indigenous teachers, not because of lack of will, but due to a lack of familiarity with said worldview. Similarly, Prest et al. Have noted that although the Ministry of Education of British Columbia has mandated the inclusion of Indigenous worldviews in K-12 curriculum, teachers were likewise reluctant to engage due to the fear of misrepresenting these worldviews. This gap in training and knowledge acquisition is perhaps the biggest hurdle we need to address in K-12 teacher training programs in Canada. Milne concludes that Indigenous curricular training should be made a requirement for teaching certification and through continued professional development opportunities for forward movement in this process. The innate discursive power of music as a carrier of collective memory and tradition will have an important role to play in rebuilding, rethinking, rekindling, and reshaping broken societies, and seems very apropos to explore in the Canadian context. Degenociding for me is more than decolonizing. It is about offering all Canadian learners a consistent and meaningful relationship with their environment through land-based Indigenous metaphors, histories, and aesthetics, thus improving the quality of education. It is a mechanism for rebuilding an identity that has grounded normativity at its core. Grounded normativity comes from millennia of knowledge given to inhabitants by the land itself. To add depth and dignity to Canadian identity, we must enable our children to listen and understand, to be attuned to the voice, the song of this land. And to give us hope, allow me to quote Christina Sharp. So we are here in the weather, here in the singularity. Here there is disaster and possibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Van, for your very interesting presentation. Let's all give him a round of applause. I know I'm the only one unmuted right now, so you can only hear me, but
Thank
I see all the hands. That's great. What a great way to open our symposium. Thank you again, Van.